The train came in just before noon, and the platform at Harlow Creek was never quiet at noon. The feed merchant stood near the water barrel talking to the postmaster. Two women from the church auxiliary had positioned themselves close enough to the depot steps to see everything without appearing to look. A boy of about 8 sat on an overturned crate and swung his legs and watched the rail car doors with the open attention that only children are still permitted. The door opened. She stepped down with a suitcase in her right hand and nothing in her left. She was not young in the way that draws easy sympathy, and she was not old enough to be dismissed. Somewhere in that particular decade of life, where a woman has already made several hard decisions and carries them in the set of her jaw rather than on her face. Her coat was good wool, charcoal gray, but it had been let out at the seams and taken in again. Someone had done that work carefully, but it had been done. Her boots were dry. She had packed for arrival, not for the journey. She stood on the platform and looked at the main street of Harlow Creek, the way a person looks at a map they have already memorized, but are seeing the terrain of for the first time, taking in the distances, adjusting. The feed merchant's conversation slowed without stopping. The postmaster's eyes moved to the platform and back. One of the churchwomen said something to the other in a voice pitched for two, and the other nodded in the particular way that means the conversation will continue indoors. The boy on the crate kept swinging his legs. She had a letter. She had unfolded it before stepping off the train, and she refolded it now by feel without looking at it and put it in her coat pocket. The address she was looking for was 3 buildings east of the depot. She had been told this in correspondence. She counted. The general store, a narrow building with no sign that she could yet read, a farrier's from the sound. She picked up her suitcase and walked. The dust on the main street of Harlow Creek in October was the fine kind, the kind that has been walked and ridden and driven over so many times that it has given up any texture and become simply part of the air. It coated the boardwalk in a thin, pale layer. Her boots left prints going east. The suitcase was not light. She did not adjust her grip or shift it to her other hand. What was in it, she had not told anyone. Had told no one, in fact, since there was no one to tell. A change of clothes, a tin of buttons, a small ceramic pot with a cracked lid that she had wrapped in her second skirt, and a recipe book written in her mother's hand, in Danish. The building with no sign had a door that was set back slightly from the boardwalk, recessed into the frame as though the structure had inhaled and forgotten to breathe out again. She stopped in front of it. There was a window to the left of the door, clean enough that she could see her own shape in it, a dark column with a suitcase hanging from one arm. She did not look long. She knocked. Nothing for a moment. Then footsteps, not hurried, not slow, just deliberate. The footsteps of someone who does not change their pace for a knock at the door. The man who opened it was several years past 30, with sawdust on his left forearm and a look on his face that was not unfriendly and not welcoming either. It was simply open. He assessed the situation the way a person reads weather, quickly, without drama. She told him who she was. She told him the name of the woman who had written the correspondence. She said she had been told there was a room. He looked at the suitcase. He looked at the street behind her, which was empty. He said the room was above the kitchen. He said the woman she was looking for had been his mother, and that his mother had passed in September. She held this, did not flinch, did not fill the silence with apology. She asked if the room was still available. He was quiet for a moment, not thinking about whether to trust her. She would understand this later, but thinking about the room itself, which had belonged to his mother before it had been a spare room, and which had not been entered since the bed had been stripped. He said yes. She followed him inside. The building was a carpenter's workshop at the front. Sawhorses, planks stacked along one wall, the smell of cedar and something else underneath it. Pine resin or linseed, oil? She could not tell which. A narrow staircase at the back. At the top, a short hall and a door that stuck at the bottom where the frame had swelled. He pushed it open with his shoulder. The room was small. A bed, a chest, a window that looked out over the alley, and, past that, the open country that began abruptly behind the last building on the east side of Harlo Creek. The light was flat and gray and honest. He said board and wages, if she could cook. He said there was a kitchen off the workshop that he had not much used. She set her suitcase down on the floor beside the bed. She did not open it. She said she could cook. He nodded. He said supper was whenever she felt ready. He did not ask what she knew how to make. He went back down the stairs. She heard his footsteps cross the workshop floor, and then the sound of a plane moving against wood, steady and unhurried, starting up again as though she had not interrupted anything at all. She stood at the window for a moment after his footsteps faded. The open country past the alley was the color of dry grass, pale and even, running out to a ridge she could not name. She had not seen that much open space in a long time. In the city, there had always been something in the way. She unpacked the suitcase without hurrying. 3 dresses, a wool shawl, 2 aprons, a tin of needles and thread, a small book with a cracked spine she did not open, and at the bottom, wrapped in one of the aprons so it would not shift, a ceramic crock sealed with wax and cloth. Her mother's sourdough, kept alive through 6 weeks of travel by feeding it every second day from whatever flour she could find. She set the crock on the chest and looked at it for a moment. Then she went down to find the kitchen. It was a narrow room that ran along the back of the workshop, separated from it by a thin wall through which she could hear the plane working in long, even strokes. A cast iron stove, cold. A water pump over a low basin. Shelves with flour, cornmeal, salt, a tin of lard, a handful of dried beans that had been there long enough to have gone pale. A single pot. 2 skillets, one of them warped at the handle. She lit the stove with kindling from the box beside it and let it take its time. She had cooked in worse. She had cooked in a ship's galley on a crossing that took 19 days and left everyone on board unable to look at the horizon without swallowing. She had cooked in her aunt's house in a city where the gas ran low in winter, and you learned to manage flame carefully or you went cold. She knew how to make something from almost nothing, and she knew that the first meal mattered, not because it had to be remarkable, but because it told the truth about what kind of cook she was. She found an onion in a sack near the door, 3 potatoes, firm enough, a small piece of salt pork wrapped in cloth. She worked quietly, aware of the sound coming through the wall. The plane. A pause. The plane again. She did not try to make conversation through the partition. She did not announce what she was doing. She simply cooked and let the smell of it go where it wanted. The bread she could not make tonight. The starter needed a day to wake from travel. But she uncovered the crock and fed it a spoonful of flour and a little water, and set it near the back of the stove where the heat was gentle. By the time the stew was ready, the light through the kitchen's one small window had gone the color of ash. She set 2 bowls on the work table without calling out. She waited a moment, then went to the partition and knocked twice with her knuckle. Not loud. A knock that said, "When you're ready, not now." The plane stopped. She heard the low scrape of a stool, then footsteps, then the door between the workshop and the kitchen opened. He stood in the frame and looked at the bowls, then at her, then at the bowls again. His hands were dusted with wood shavings. He had a straight, closed face. Not unfriendly, simply a face that had learned not to offer anything before it knew what was being asked of it. He crossed to the basin and washed his hands without being told. She sat down. He sat across from her. He picked up the spoon and ate. She watched him take the first mouthful the way she always watched. Not for a reaction she could use, but because the first mouthful told her something about whether the salt had been right, whether the onion had cooked long enough. He did not look up from the bowl. He ate steadily, without comment. She ate too. Outside the window, Harlan's main street was going dark by degrees. Someone crossed at the far end with a lantern. A dog barked once and was answered by nothing. She had made the stew simple on purpose. There had been no opportunity for anything else, but she would have made the same choice anyway. A cook who tried to impress on the first night was a cook who didn't trust the ingredients. She trusted the ingredients. Halfway through, he reached forward and tore a piece of the hardtack she'd found in a tin above the shelf and used it to press against the bottom of the bowl. She had seen her father do that. She had seen men in 3 countries do that. She looked at the crock near the back of the stove. By morning, it would have started. By the second day, she'd know whether the travel had weakened it or whether it had come through whole. She had kept it alive across 6 weeks and 2 oceans and the length of a continent. She was not anxious about it. She simply wanted to know. He finished and set the spoon down. She expected him to stand. He didn't. He sat with his hands flat on the table the way a man sits when he has decided to stay for a minute more. Not because there is anything to say, but because leaving immediately would be a kind of rudeness he didn't intend. She didn't fill the silence. After a while, he said, "Where'd you learn?" Not "that was good." Not "thank you." Just the plain question, stripped of its verb the way some men stripped everything down to what was necessary. "My mother," she said, and then a woman in Copenhagen who ran a house for boarders. He nodded once. Then he stood and carried his bowl to the basin himself. He was up before first light. She heard the back step, the third one down that had a particular creak, different from the others, lower in pitch, and then the sound of the barn door dragging against frozen ground. She lay still for a moment longer, then got up. The crock was where she had left it, pushed back near the stove's warmth. She lifted the cloth. The surface had begun to shift, faintly, barely visible in the gray early light. But there. The starter had come through. She covered it again and set the kettle on. By the time he came back in from the barn, she had coffee ready and bread from the previous day's loaf, set out with butter from the cold box. He hung his coat on the peg without looking at the table. When he turned and saw the coffee, he paused for just a moment, then came and sat. She stood at the window while he drank. The valley was white below a white sky. A line of cottonwoods marked where the creek ran, and beyond them she could see the outline of a ridge she had no name for yet. She had been naming things in her mind. The ridge, the dry gully to the east, the particular rock formation near the road that looked from a distance like a man sitting with his knees up. She gave places names privately, the way she had in every town she had passed through. It helped her remember where she was. He finished his coffee and stood and went back out without speaking. That was the shape of the mornings, she understood. Not unfriendly, simply efficient. He had work. She had work. The talking, if there was any, would come later, or not at all. She began the bread. The starter went into the bowl first, then flour, then water. She had let come to the right temperature by feel. She had made this bread so many times her hands did it without instruction. She pressed the heel of her palm into the dough and felt it push back. Not enough yet, still too soft, and kept working. By mid-morning, the kitchen held the smell of it. She had propped the door open to let in air, and the cold came in low along the floor the way cold does, and the warmth from the stove pushed down to meet it, and there was a particular quality to that combined temperature that she associated with her mother's kitchen in a house she had not stood in for 11 years. She did not dwell on that. She shaped the loaves and set them to rise near the stove and went to look again at the crock. It was moving now, quietly, steadily, the way something alive does when it has found its footing again after a long journey. She put the cloth back. Outside, somewhere behind the barn, she could hear him working. He had been at the fence line since early morning. She could hear the rhythm of it. The mallet coming down, pause, the mallet again. Even spacing. He worked the way he moved through a room, without excess, without hurry, and the sound of it had settled into the background of her morning, without her noticing, until it stopped. The silence lasted a few minutes. Then she heard boots on the porch steps. He knocked twice on the open door before coming in. His coat was damp at the shoulders. He looked at the loaves near the stove and did not say anything about them, only moved to the basin and worked the pump handle and washed his hands. She asked if he wanted coffee. He said he did. She poured it and set the cup on the table and went back to the crock. The cloth had lifted slightly at one corner from the pressure inside. She pressed it back down with 2 fingers. He sat with the cup between his palms and watched the kitchen the way a man watches something he is trying to understand, without asking about it. After a moment, he said the fence along the north pasture had been sitting wrong since August, and he should have gotten to it before the ground hardened. She said she had wondered why the cattle kept drifting. He looked up. She kept her eyes on the crock. She did not elaborate. He drank the coffee slowly. The loaves had begun to expand against the cloth she had draped over them, the dough pressing into the weave. He watched that without comment. After a while, he said, "The smell of that is something." She said it needed another hour. He said he had time. She did not look at him. She took the bread paddle down from its hook and turned it in her hands, checking the grain out of habit. There was a long, shallow crack along the handle she had not noticed before. She ran her thumbnail along it. He saw her stop. He said he could fix that. She said it was fine. He said it would split through by spring if it wasn't seen to. She set it on the table in front of him. He turned it over in his hands and looked at the crack the same way she had, thumb running the length of it. Then he set it aside without another word. She refilled his cup without asking. He did not acknowledge it with more than a slight adjustment of his hands around the cup, making room for the new warmth. Outside, the wind had picked up. It moved across the gap under the door and made the stove breathe a little differently. She listened to the change. Somewhere on the property, something, a board, a gate latch, knocked once and settled. He heard it too. He was already calculating. He stood without announcing it. Put on his coat with the methodical patience of a man who had done the same thing in the same sequence 10,000 times. Left side first, then right. Then the collar turned down flat. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He lifted the bread paddle from the table and tucked it under his arm. She said he didn't have to do that tonight. He said the wind was already up and it wouldn't get better. She did not argue. She understood the logic of a man who fixed things before they became worse things. She had married one. She had buried one. She recognized the type the way you recognize weather. Not from what it says, but from how it moves. He went out. She heard his boots on the porch, then on the frozen ground. Then nothing as the wind took the sound. She cleared the cups, wiped the table, put the cloth over the bowl of dough that would need another rise by morning. The kitchen settled around her the way a house does when it has been emptied of company. Not lonely exactly, but aware of itself. Through the window she could see the lamp in the workshop, a still yellow rectangle against the dark and the moving grass. He had lit it without her seeing him light it, which meant he had carried matches, which meant he had planned to stay. She did not know what to do with that. She sat down at the table with the mending basket. There were 3 shirts in it, all his, left folded at the back door the week before with no note, no instruction, just the silent assumption that this was something she did. She did not mind. She was good with a needle and had nothing against the work. But she sat with the first shirt across her lap and did not thread the needle. She looked at the window, at the lamp. She had been careful. She had been careful with herself since she arrived. The way you are careful with something that has been broken and reset and might not hold a second time. She had kept things even, practical. She had not let herself read too much into a cup of coffee or a fixed hinge or the way he always seemed to know when she was low on wood before she knew it herself. But a man who carries matches to your workshop at night because he has already decided to stay, that is not nothing. She threaded the needle, made the first stitch on the cuff where the fabric had frayed. Outside, the lamp held steady despite the wind, which meant the shutters were angled right, which meant he knew this property already in a way that took time to learn. She kept her eyes on the shirt. She made the stitch even and small. The next morning he was gone before she came down. The lamp outside was cold. The shutters had been set back to their open position, which was how she kept them in fair weather, and she stood in the doorway a moment noting that. He had noticed the difference. He had put things back the way she had them. She made coffee, set out 1 cup without thinking, then noticed, then did not take it back. Left it on the counter where it was. The shirt was finished. She had sat with it until well past 10, making the stitches smaller than they needed to be, which was what she did when her hands needed something to do while her mind worked through a thing. She had folded it and set it on the workbench near the door. She had not put a price on it because he had not asked for one, and she did not know how to begin. At mid-morning, the woman from the general store came in for a fitting. She talked the way she always did, easily and about everything. And near the end, she said she had seen the deputy crossing the street toward the workshop 2 nights running. She said it without particular weight, just mentioned it. She kept her eyes on the hem she was pinning and said only that he had brought wood. The woman from the store said nothing to that, which was its own kind of comment. After she left, the shop was quiet. The light came through the front window at a low angle and landed on the folded shirt on the workbench. She looked at it for a moment, then went back to her work. He came that afternoon, near 4, knocked once, which he did not always do, and she called him in. He came to the workbench and saw the shirt and picked it up, turned it over, looked at the cuff where she had mended it. She kept working. He said, "You didn't have to do the whole cuff." She said the thread wouldn't have held otherwise. He turned it over again, set it down, then picked it up again and folded it differently, more carefully, the way a person handles something they intend to keep. He did not say anything else about it. He set it under his arm and stood there a moment, the way he did when he was deciding whether to go. She said, "There's coffee if it's still warm." He checked the pot, said it was. He poured 1 cup, not 2, and stood at the counter and drank it without sitting down. She worked. He did not make conversation, and neither did she, and the quiet was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that had started to feel like something they had agreed to without discussing it. When he set the cup down, she heard the small sound of it. He said he would bring wood tomorrow. He brought the wood the next day and the day after that. He stacked it along the west wall of the shed where it would stay driest, and she did not ask him to do it that way. He had simply looked at the shed, looked at the direction of the weather coming in off the ridge, and stacked it there. She noticed. She did not say so. The days had shortened considerably. By 4 in the afternoon, the light was going amber and thin, and by 5 it was gone. She had started keeping a candle on the workbench so she could finish through the early dark without straining. The candle was a plain tallow one she had bought at the general store. Nothing particular about it. But she had started lighting it at the same time each evening, and that consistency became a kind of ritual. The match, the catch of flame, the smell of it, and then the return to work. He came in one evening, and she had already lit it. He looked at it without comment and poured his coffee and stood at the counter the way he always did. She was working on a child's coat, the seam at one shoulder gone entirely, and she was rebuilding it from the inside out. He watched her for a moment, not intrusively, the way a person might watch a fire. Then he looked away. She said, "Astrid talked today." A whole sentence, she means. He was quiet. Then he said, "What did she say?" She said, "She asked where you were." He put the cup down, picked it up again. She did not look at him, but she heard the pause in his stillness. He said, "What did you tell her?" She said, "That you'd be back." Another silence. He finished the coffee. The candle moved in some draft she couldn't locate. He said, "She's talking more." She said she had noticed. He said, "Before." She didn't. He stopped. She kept working and gave him the quiet to finish or not. He said, "It's been a while since she did." She did not fill that. She let it stand in the room with them, where it needed to stand. After a moment, he said he had found a loose board in the floor of the back room. He could fix it Saturday if she wanted. She said that would be fine. He pulled on his coat. He was at the door when she said, "She asked me something else, too." He stopped. She said, "She asked if you were going to stay." He stood with his hand on the door frame. He did not turn around. She said, "I didn't know what to tell her." He was quiet for long enough that the candle moved again. Then he said, "Tell her I'll be back tomorrow with the wood." He went out. She listened to his boots cross the porch, and then she listened to the quiet after. She stood at the counter a long time after the boots faded. The candle had settled. The kitchen was warm still from the stove, but cooling at the edges, the way it always did once the fire dropped. She put her hand flat on the counter and looked at nothing in particular, and then she straightened and blew out the candle and went to bed. Saturday came gray and cold. She was up before light, the way she always was, and she had the stove fed and the coffee on before she heard him in the yard. She did not go to the window. She heard the axe, and then the pause, and then the axe again, a steady rhythm that filled the quiet, the way weather fills a valley, not intruding, just present. The girl was still asleep. She mixed the dough and left it to rise and began on the morning's bread. When she heard boots on the porch steps, she did not look up from the board. He knocked once and came in with the cold on him, his coat dark at the shoulders from the damp. He said the stack was done. She said the coffee was ready. He poured it himself. He stood by the stove with the cup and said the backboard needed a different nail than he had brought. He'd be back Tuesday with the right size. She said that was fine. The girl appeared in the doorway in her nightgown with her hair loose and tangled from sleep. She looked at him and then at the kitchen and then at the bread dough on the counter. She said, "Are we making something?" She said they were, and she handed her the small wooden spoon that was just the right size. The girl climbed up onto the step stool without being asked. He watched this. She didn't look at him, but she felt him watching it. The three of them were quiet together in the kitchen for a while. The girl stirring something she would soon declare done, the dough rising under its cloth, the stove ticking as it settled into its heat. Outside, the sky had gone from gray to the color of old tin. Snow coming, maybe by afternoon. He refilled his cup. At some point, the girl stopped stirring and looked up at him and said, "She makes everything good." He said he knew. The girl said, "Do you like it here?" He looked down at her and then across the kitchen to the window. He said, "Yes." Just the one word, and the girl seemed satisfied with it and went back to her stirring. She pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. He was still standing by the stove. The snow started before noon, small and quiet, the kind that doesn't announce itself. It had already covered the wood stack by the time anyone thought to look. She served the bread at midday. She cut it while it was still warm enough to steam, and she set the slices on the board without ceremony. The girl took hers with both hands and did not put it down until it was gone. He ate standing at the counter the way he always did the first week, and then the second, and now still, though she had noticed he had moved slightly closer to the table each time, as though the distance was closing on its own without either of them deciding it. The snow kept coming. Not hard, just steady, the way it sometimes did in this country. Patient and without any interest in being noticed. She went back to the window once while the bread was being eaten and looked out at the road. Empty. The cottonwood at the far end of the lot had gone white along the top branches. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to. Then she turned back to the kitchen. He was watching the girl finish her bread. The girl had crumbs on her collar and was not concerned about it. She asked if there would be more tomorrow, and she said yes. The girl nodded as though this was an important piece of information she had been waiting on. After the meal, he put on his coat. He said he was going to bring in more wood before the storm settled in. She said that was a good idea. He pulled the door behind him, and she heard his boots on the steps, and then nothing but the snow. She washed the board. She washed the knife. The girl carried the cups to the basin without being asked, which was a thing she had started doing sometime in the last few weeks. She could not have said exactly when. At some point, she found herself standing in the middle of the kitchen without anything in her hands. She had not done that in a long time. Stopped, without a task. Just stood in the middle of a room and let the quiet hold her for a moment. She could hear him outside, the dull knock of the axe hitting the splitting block. Steady, unhurried. The same rhythm he brought to everything. The girl had gone to the window seat with a piece of string she was making into something complicated. She was talking to herself quietly in the way children do when they have forgotten they are not alone. She picked up a cloth and put it down again. Outside, the splitting block went quiet. A moment passed. Then she heard the stack of wood being set against the side of the house. Log by log, the sound of it building up. She went to the stove to check the heat. The door at the back would open soon. She knew the sound of his boots on the top step well enough now to know when he was almost there. The door opened the way it always did. A pause at the threshold where he knocked the worst of the mud off his boots against the step before coming in. She did not turn around. She heard him set something on the bench near the door. Heard the weight of his coat come off. The small sounds of a man who had learned to move through a space without disturbing the air in it more than necessary. The girl said something from the window seat without looking up from her string. He answered her in the low, plain way he always did, as if her questions deserved real consideration rather than the half-attention most adults gave children. She had noticed that early on. He did not speak down to her. He spoke across. She ladled the soup into the bowl she had set out and carried it to the table. He came and sat. He did not say it smelled good, the way some men did by rote. He simply sat down and picked up the spoon, and she understood from the steadiness of that gesture that the compliment was in the sitting, in the staying. She sat across from him. The girl abandoned the string and climbed into her chair, and they ate together the way they had been eating together for some time now. Not in silence exactly, but without performance. The girl talked when she had something to say. They answered when there was something to answer. The fire held its own conversation with the draft coming under the door. At some point she looked up and found him looking at her. Not quickly, not away. He held it for just a moment the way a person holds something they have been careful with. Then he looked back down at his bowl. She set her spoon down. She did not say anything. There was nothing yet that needed to be said. But she reached across the table and moved the breadboard an inch closer to his side, for no reason, and he broke off a piece of the bread without comment, and that was all. The candle on the shelf had been burning since October. She had put it there when the cold first came in earnest, thinking she would move it later. She had not moved it. It had gone down, and she had replaced the candle twice without making a thing of it, without acknowledging to herself that she had done it. Tonight it threw its small, ordinary light across the shelf and the wall. and the faces of the two people sitting at the table, and the child between them who was out telling a long, involved story about something that had happened at school. The fire settled. Outside, the wind came off the open country and moved around the corners of the house the way it had all winter, looking for a way in. It did not find one.